Our final speaker this morning is Dr. Robert Murphy of the Mises Institute, and he'll be talking about his study guide for Mises's Human Action. Bob?
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here. This is for those. This is your first time here. This really is an excellent academic conference. I just want to say, you see the blurbs, promoting this thing, and people say this is the best run conference I've ever been to. It really is good. For those of you other academics, you can attest to that. That things are interesting. I mean, when I go to the more formal mainstream academic conferences, I went into a few sessions, and it's really hard to stay awake. And, in here, I hope not the case. People are nodding off as I'm speaking and contradicting it, but it really is, so for those of you who's the first time here, it's going to be great, all right? Just wait and see, starting right after this talk. Now, so I'm here to discuss the Human Action Study Guide. Now, I had to bring up and show you, because what you don't get from seeing it, here or even the bookstore, is the fact that it's got this spiral binding. And the reason they did that, because on the one hand, you want to make, this is a nice tome and it's supposed to be on your bookshelf and you never use it, but that's not the point of this. Here the thing is it's supposed to be useful for students, and so the reason, Jeff Tucker and I talked about this for the study guide to Man, Economy, and State, which a brilliant author did a few years back. And for those at home, that's me, that's the joke. You put it open like this on the desktop, so you got Human Action over here, and you're trying to take notes and do things. So that's the point, that you're not having to, go get a fire log or something to hold the thing open, and that's the point. So again, this was done with you in mind. I noticed listening to the other people talk that Tom Woods went first, I'm going last, and I think they did that on purpose, because in many respects, Tom's talk is the exact opposite. His experience with his books were the opposite of mine. So one thing is, of course, he gets royalties for his books, and that's why he's a big showman. On the other hand, I got a lump sum for this. I really don't care if you buy this or not at this point. Yeah. Whereas Tom is going to be, he has a trench coat. He's like, hey, come here. You heard about the Constitution? That's a nice watch you got there. I'll sign it for the watch. What do you think? That's Tom's. Another difference is Tom mentioned that he wrote his, in great haste, very quick, a few months, I think. In contrast, and this part's true. Most of what else I say in this talk might not be, but this is true, that Jeff Tucker and I, when this thing came out and we were trying to remember, he's like, Bob, how long have you been working on this? And we couldn't remember. I mean, it had been so long. I had a full head of hair at the time, I believe. And in fact, I think Mises himself asked me, can you write a study guide for my book? And I said I'd get right on that. And then although one thing is, we do have similar stories in that, Tom mentioned that he wouldn't do a radio show unless they let him bash the Fed. Sort of similar thing. Oprah Winfrey's people, they wanted me, to be on to talk about the book. I said, we're doing praxeology or I walk, all right? And so for those of you at home, you're like, what's this guy talk? Is that? And if you go Google Human Action Study Guide Oprah Winfrey Show, you're not going to find it, and that's the point. Is I'm sticking to my guns, and she. All right. So in case you expect me to talk about the book, let me cater to that preference. In terms of the structure of the book, the basic outline, so it goes through human action, obviously. Each chapter, it starts out with a summary of the entire chapter, and we broke it down down to, I think, even the italicized subsection, so that you really, if you're getting lost in a section in human action, you can go to this thing and see what's going on right here. And that really is important for a book like Human Action, because Mises does assume a lot on the part of the reader. All right, so it's if you're new to the Austrian school and some people say, you got to read Human Action, and you tried to read it and just found it impossible, that's not because you're stupid. I mean, you might be stupid, but it doesn't mean you're stupid. It's because, like I said, Mises did assume a lot. I mean, he assumed that everyone's read boehm-bawerk, and so Mises doesn't even, give a few block quotations to bring you up to speed before he knocks him down. He just says, the boehm-bawerk's causes of the interest is wrong because of blah, 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 and you don't even know what he's talking about. And so that's one function of this, is just to make sure you understand what's going on there. Then I also give in the study guide, after the summary of the whole chapter, I give why it matters, and that's to either relate the material of the chapter to economics in general, to explain, because the difficulty is Mises, he'll spend a lot of time knocking down some theory that isn't in vogue anymore. And so you say, why is he spending so many pages beating this thing up when who the heck talks about that? And so I explained in the book that, well, actually that was a big deal back when Mises was writing, or it had been a big deal a few decades before. And so Mises felt the need to really make sure that he eliminated that error, or really show the problems with that mistaken way of thinking. So that's another function of this. The other thing, though, I do in the Why It Matters section is I explain the point of the chapter in relation to the rest of the book in Human Action. And that's something that I hadn't even realized until this time of, reading the book again to write this study guide. I think I had read it, 2 or 3 times before over the years. And, each time I read it, really it was different. I know that sounds cliched, but seriously, I read it in high school and I didn't get most of it. And then, the more, again, I realize how corny it sounds, but it's like Mises gets smarter the older you get, and when you keep going back and rereading Human Action, that you realize that, wow, he really took something that was incredibly difficult and got it across in a very relatively comprehensible manner. Now, one problem, of course, is his vocabulary is also very big, and again, that's part of the function of the study guide, is to try to break it down. Little things like he'll say the term rational action is pleonastic. And you have to go to Google. What the heck does that even mean? And it's, redundant. Oh, okay. And so, that's what I'm saying. Stuff like that where, and then once you realize that, so he's saying rational action. No, that all action is rational in that sense of the term. So, he does things like that. And that's the point of the study guide, is to try to make it comprehensible to you. What else do I do? And then after the Why It Matters part, I'm sorry. Let me finish that train of thought. The Why It Matters, what I noticed on this reading was that the chapters really, they're not just thrown in randomly, okay? It's not that Mises sat down, brainstormed, and thought, okay, what do I need to cover? And then he just put the chapters in there. There really is a coherent flow that you're not going to get. So even if you're a faculty member and you haven't read it since college, I would encourage you sometime before you die, sit down and read the thing again, cover to cover, because it logically builds each chapter. In other words, he can't address certain things until he's already laid the foundation, and he does it in a very systematic manner. So, the outline, what he covers in each chapter, it really does make a logical, coherent argument that builds upon the work up till that point. And even the breakdowns of the sections, which is something I never even realized until writing the study guide, when I had to explain in the Why It Matters part, now that we're in part 2, why did he put the division of the different parts of the book where he did? And it really does make sense. And like I said, I didn't even notice it until I wrote this. So that's another thing that sort of encourage you if you're just intimidated. Because, the book is this big, the Human Action is. And so I understand why, if you're in college, you might think, well, I'm not going to bother reading this. Didn't Murray Rothbard already break the thing down into simpler language? Yes, Rothbard did do that in terms of the economics. So in Man, Economy, and State, if you just want to know Austrian economics per se, I would say read Man, Economy, and State first, rather than Human Action to be your starting point, because that's what Rothbard does in that book. But there's so much more in Human Action that I think if you want to call yourself, certainly if you want to call yourself a Misesian, you have to read Human Action at some point. And the point of this study guide, of course, is to make that less of an intimidating task. And then also in the book, I have technical issues, a little section in each chapter talking about things. So there I cover stuff in case there's potential contradictions, things that might have confused the reader, that maybe Mises seems to be changing his definition. And there's a few things like that where earlier on, when he says, what's the definition of economics and how does it relate to praxeology in terms of his the definitions and the boundaries around those different fields, there's a little bit where maybe he's moving the definitions around, and so I'm at least noting that stuff so the reader doesn't think that he or she is misunderstanding something, and so to make sure the reader understands the potential problems, but also to relate it to, it's mostly for graduate students, that particular section of the book, so that if you're in grad school and you're learning all these things, the rational expectations theory and solo growth model, how do you relate that stuff to the things that Mises talks about? And one thing I would say is a lot of people who try to read Mises and they're coming from a mainstream framework, they think that, he's hopelessly out of date, and he obviously didn't follow mainstream economics. But part of what's going on there is he was up to speed in terms of mainstream theory when he wrote the book. And so, things like sweeping statements he'll make about mainstream economics were true at the time when he said it. So to give you an example, he said, when he's talking about game theory, he says something like, in the market economy is nothing like a game, because in the market economy, both people can win in a transaction, whereas in a game, it's a zero-sum game. And I'm putting words in his mouth, but that was his point. And so you'll hear modern game theorists say, oh, this Mises guy was an idiot, that he didn't understand that game theory is broader than that, and you can have positive-sum games studied with the techniques that John Nash gave to us. But I point out in the study guide that, well, no, actually, when Mises wrote that, he was correct, that in its infancy, game theory really was only studying zero-sum games, and so what Mises wrote was perfectly correct at the time. All right, so things like that to show you that Mises actually did understand mainstream economics when he wrote this thing, and he obviously couldn't have anticipated how far these idiots would have pushed things, because he thought, I showed you here that's the wrong path, why would you persist? Okay, that wasn't even supposed to be a laugh line. All right, there's a few other random points, and then I'll throw it open for questions. As far as why you should read this book, because I want to encourage people, and Jeff Tucker and I talked about this, the part of the reason we want to do this is because we realize that a lot of the younger generation, and I say it like I'm 80 years old, a lot of the people coming up who are learning Austrian economics, a lot of them are Austrians because they're libertarians, right? And they got into the liberty movement through that route, and then, well, gee, most libertarians subscribe, or a lot of libertarians subscribe to this Austrian school. Let me check it out. And I've heard people literally saying things to the effect of, well, there's no way I'm going to sit down and read Human Action. Why, I got, illegal drugs to go try. That's their. And I hope there's a delay with the video so they can cut that out. It'll flash a picture of Mises. We're experiencing technical difficulties. Okay. So why would you read Human Action? I mean, because for one thing, just to understand how smart this guy was, and you don't get that unless you read something like Human Action, where in order for him to explain what economics is and is not, and he relates to all sorts of things. So he's talking about the law of diminishing marginal utility, and then in a footnote he points out that this is not the same thing as the physiological law. Weber Fechner pointed out where, these psychologists, I think they found that if you are increasing a stimulus like light, that in order for a human to appreciate the further increments in the intensity of the light, you have to keep upping the increment size, right? So if you start with a really dim light and then increase it by a certain amount in terms of objective measurements of how much light's coming out, in order for the human subject to say, okay, yeah, I realize that you just increased it, you got to keep making the increments bigger and bigger in order for them to register that. And so Mises points out in a footnote, that's not what I'm talking about with the law of diminishing marginal utility, all right? Or later, I don't even remember what the issue was in economics that he was trying to relate it to, but he points out in a footnote, this has nothing to do with quantum mechanics. And he really knows what he's talking about. I mean, or at least he knows enough, because for what I know about, if I don't know what I'm talking about, how would I know that he does? But you get what I'm saying. That right. So in praising him, I'm actually saying I'm really smart. But you see what I'm saying. He really does go through those. Or one of my favorite lines, and I should have gone to get the exact quote, but I think he says something like, he's got a whole section with the case versus class probability, and he starts saying, the treatment of probability has been confused by the mathematicians, right? That's how he starts this section, and then this economist is going to tell us how throughout history, that the history of mathematicians dealing with the subject of probability and the different theories, and why these guys, this guy kind of had it right, but now I'm Mises, I'm going to tell you this is the way to think about probability per se, not, how do we use probability in economics? Mises is telling us this is what probability is. Right, so that kind of stuff, it's very audacious. So whether or not you agree with him, it's sort of impressive that, holy cow, this guy who's writing an economics treatise is just going to, by the way, this is the way to think about probability theory. Right? That's pretty impressive. The only, in terms of the other side, in terms of, who's going to go up against our Goliath, it would be Paul Samuelson, I suppose, that he likes to dabble and say things like, no, this mathematician in 1600 proved such and such. And I can't prove this to you, but believe me, there have been plenty of times in Samuelson's work when I was at NYU and I'd be reading a paper and Samuelson would go off on one of his little historical tangents and it would be wrong, right? It'd be kind of right, but I'd say to the Turkish guy who was much better at math than I was and say, he didn't just prove that there's an infinite number of primes, did he? And he looks at his, he skipped a step, right? And this is Paul Samuelson, right? And so he likes to give this appearance that, I'm a really sharp guy and just, dazzle people with all of his knowledge, but Mises really, like I said, you could quibble, and people in the various fields would quibble with him, but I mean, it's a very coherent, defensible position. He's a thinker to be reckoned with, not just in economics, but in all these other things as well. And so that's what you get, and you wouldn't know that unless you really sat down and read Human Action cover to cover, and this is what's going to help you do that. So by all means, go buy it. It doesn't benefit me personally. Have we got time? All right, no questions, sorry. Bye-bye.